Hello, this is Professor JPS, and this is a lecture for Communication Arts 154, Film Study and Appreciation. This is for it's Wednesday, April 15th, but this is a lecture for tomorrow, Wednesday, April 16th. It would be your 1 o'clock class. And this is for Chapter 11, Theory, and the film The 400 Blows. Now, this is a French film, so will take some effort on your part if you're able to see it or download it. I noticed that sometimes you can even get it from local libraries on something called Canopy. It's also only a couple dollars on some YouTube channels. And anyway, it's not a very long movie, but it's a very, very moving film. But do pay careful attention to the analysis of it and the analysis of Chapter 11. I do want to remind the Communication Arts 154 students that it was this time last week that I had a review for the exam, and then I wrote up the exam and emailed it to the entire class last Wednesday evening, a full week ago, and had given the class until Monday of this week at midnight to then hand back the exam. Now, most people have, but there's still a decent amount of people who have not actually answered that email with the exam answers sent to me in an email attachment. I know some people had their power out earlier in the week because of the storms, but for those of you who have just not answered me back at all, please just email me, okay? I can't emphasize this enough. You have to stay in touch. Again, forgive me if there's real serious issues, if people have COVID in your family, or if you have COVID. Of course, my heart and prayers go out to all of you. But we only meet once a week, so I've been pretty clear. There's always a lecture the night before the Thursday class. It's always clear where to find the information, both in the YouTube channel and in the emails that I've been giving to the classes. So I can't emphasize this enough. If you're not checking your NCC email address, please do so. And for whatever reason, if you can't get to your NCC email address, which I think is easy to do, if you just I think there's a way you can link your NCC email address to your personal email address through the NCC webpage. But just email me. Just be like, hey, Shields, what's going on? I'm enrolled in this class, and I have a syllabus, but weren't we supposed to have a test? I'm willing to talk. I'm willing to, let things come in late. But, a full week of not hearing from anybody, not hearing from some people in that test is a little problematic. So just try to get back to me. Communication is the key. Staying in touch is the key. Okay. So this evening's lecture has to do with film theory. And in some ways, it harkens back to our very first chapter where we were discussing realism and what was called expressionism or formalism. But now, after 8 or 9 weeks or whatever we're at, this particular chapter delves into how motion pictures really started to be treated as an art form and started to be treated as something that professors and serious scholars and writers started to talk about film in the same way they may have talked about literature and painting and classical music and architecture and poetry and other aspects of the arts that movies were not even part of that consideration really until the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And it wasn't really till after the 1950s that motion pictures were even discussed as an art form, popular or otherwise. So I just want to kind of talk a little bit about that idea. Now, you're in a college class and you're learning some things about elements of filmmaking and, how editing worked or how acting worked or how a script might have worked. But I want to talk about movies as something valuable to be studied, right? Movies aren't that old, right? If you compare motion pictures to other art forms, movies didn't get started until the 1890s. I mean, in terms of studying a particular kind of subject like films, that's really young. Film is the new kid on the block. If we consider that literature, theater, painting, and other art forms, architecture, dance, music, those things have been studied for centuries, right? I mean, the Renaissance was in the 1500s and early 1600s, right? Literature and painting and all those other art forms have had centuries of academics or academicians looking into what makes those things valuable and interesting. And you guys, for the most part, at the beginning of your college career, and perhaps you've had an art history course, or perhaps you know a bit about music, or perhaps you know a little bit about painting, theater, literature, poetry, and so forth. But you're kind of used to the idea by 2020 that, yeah, there's a place for film in the realm of the academic, right? But movies really were just considered a commercial art form. I'm sorry, a commercial form, not an art form, when they were invented and when they were first in what we'll call Nickelodeons, and then a little bit of larger movie theaters. They were completely dispensable. You watched a movie one week and then a new movie came in the next couple of weeks later, and just on and on and on. And it wasn't until a few people started to write about the power of film, a little bit in the 20s, a little bit in the 30s, but really after World War II, did this sort of intellectualization of film become much more powerful. And they started to offer degrees at colleges and universities in the study of film in the same way that they would have given degrees in the study of literature or painting or music or other art forms, okay? Now, what I want to talk about this evening is basically just ways in which there are, or areas in which you can discuss how to evaluate cinema and the two main threads of film theory, two basic main threads of film theory and some of the people most responsible for them. And then one really key main film theory that I think has, been pretty suitable over the past 70 years or so. Okay, so in terms of the textbook, it's chapter 11 called Critique or Theory. And the first bit of information is on page 450, where the chapter discusses the difference between reviewers, critics, and theorists. Right on page 450. And this is just a little bit of a list of how movies, generally speaking, are evaluated. Generally speaking. So you have reviewers, critics, and theorists. Now, a reviewer, generally speaking, in a newspaper or sometimes on television, and certainly all over the web these days, is generally a journalist who more or less describes the content of a film and will say whether or not it's suitable, any good, is it good for children, is it good for a date night, is it the kind of film that you'd be expecting, okay? A reviewer doesn't dive too deep into analysis of films. They're generally just giving a kind of thumbs up, thumbs down kind of idea about what the film is about and whether that film seems satisfying to that particular reviewer. And some of your smaller newspapers or radio programs or websites that are devoted to maybe fandom will have a kind of reviewer. But it's relatively superficial, and it's really just about a content analysis, what the film's about. The second of these are critics. Now, Critics, again, are also journalists for the most part, but their emphasis on evaluation is more than just describing what the film is about. A critic who's decently smart will get at some of the more artistic or aesthetic aspects of filmmaking. They will do some of the things we've been doing in this class all semester, right? They'll notice the camera angle. They'll notice how the music blends in. They'll notice a particular kind of acting style. They'll notice motifs. They'll notice the study of aesthetics, which is the study of beauty. They'll notice the artistic contribution a movie maker is making. So whereas a reviewer is relatively superficial, a critic digs a little deeper, gets below the surface level to root out what are the more interesting aspects of filmmaking. Okay? And a theorist is somebody who's much more interested in how motion pictures, how movies are a reflection of society, how motion pictures have a kind of effect on the way in which we understand the world, how motion pictures sort of become understood through the culture itself. It's a much more sort of scholastic and philosophical view, what a film theorist is interested in doing. Okay? And generally speaking, they're not journalists. Generally speaking, they're scholars. They're academicians. They're professors or people who are interested in how powerful films are, okay? And the relationship to other media, the relationship to other arts, okay? So the textbook author, Giannetti, who's been a professor for some 50 years, he is a film theorist. He's not merely just a content reviewer or even a journalist who's trying to tell you whether or not a film has some interesting parts. He's trying to talk about film and its value throughout the entire culture. How films are political, how films are social, how films are economic, how films are a sort of connected to everything within the culture, okay? So those are three things on page 450 that I think you should pay attention to, okay? Over on 453 through about 453 through page 460, the author, Giannetti, discusses some theories of realism, okay? When motion pictures started to make their mark in the cultures, in Western culture, in Europe and in the United States, roughly speaking, between 1895 and about 1930, you started to get some film theorists who started to suggest that motion pictures had a great future as an art form, okay? And one of the key theorists along this line was a German guy called Siegfried Kracauer. Siegfried Kracauer, okay? And Krakauer's information is on page 455. And in his book called Theory on Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality, Krakauer, which is, by the way, Kracauer, he was a German guy, and he was interested in how, for him, the most valuable aspect of cinema was the fact that it could show reality as it was. To him, he thought that if you could have cinema shown to the public, and in that cinema you demonstrated realism as much as possible, that it could work like a mirror back to society. And Krakauer was very much interested in what he called his theories of realism. He was saying that film, because it moved, unlike photography, I mean, it doesn't really move, but it's an illusion of movement. Unlike photography, which he also really enjoyed, motion pictures had the ability to move through time and space and actually re-demonstrate reality for a captive audience. in a 2-hour time slot or an hour and a half time slot. And for him, he thought that reproduction of reality in a cinematic way was a very important step for art, but also for understanding social reality and understanding real life. For Krakauer, he thought that motion pictures could have been world-changing because it could have been used to educate audiences and make them think about their own lives in a much more sophisticated and interesting way. He thought it could be teachable. He thought it could make people think about their own lives by showing them their own lives. Krakauer was a German guy, and he was very much interested in what was then a newfangled aspect of film. So the key for Krakauer is realism. So for him, the highest form is a documentary film, or a film that espouses a particular kind of realistic narrative. He wanted to improve conditions for most people, for working people. And he thought the more realistic a film, the better. That was Krakauer, okay? On the opposite end of the spectrum is a guy called Rudolf Arnheim. Arnheim, Arnheim, another German guy who was the complete opposite of Krakauer. For Arnheim, the real world was real enough. What he was interested in was the magic of cinema. He was interested in how cinema could take you away from the drab reality and produce such magical, majestic, hallucinatory, beautiful, aesthetic imagery with many tricks and many use of trick photography and fantasy and aesthetic qualities. In Arnheim's book, it was called Film Art, and he very much meant that film was artful. He was not interested in what Krakauer was interested in. Krakauer said movies could make people understand reality much better by showing them reality. And Arnheim said, no, people know reality. What they want is fantasy. What they want is aesthetic beauty. What they want and what they need, what they can use is something that's divergent from reality. And the further away from reality or challenging realistic dictums was the more artistic aspect for Arnheim. Now, see, when these two guys are writing, and they're both German, they're writing at a time when movies are still relatively new. But the reason I'm going on and on about Arnheim and Krakauer is they gave a sense of legitimacy to studying cinema as an art form and not just a popcorn seller, right? Like, not just, the idea that it's just a dopey movie and who cares about them. They have nothing to offer us in terms of intellectual capacities. These two German guys writing, in fact, they're writing around the German Expressionism time period, which was a very, very influential and powerful movement until Hitler stopped it in the mid to late 30s. These guys are giving a sense of power to the idea that movies or cinema can even be talked about as an academic or aesthetic art form. Now, I know that you guys are 19 and 20 years old and you're NCC students, and the idea of, two rich German fellows back in the 20s and 30s writing about film is not your idea of fun. But what I'm trying to get at is the larger issue about theory, right? Film theory had to start somewhere. Now, it doesn't start exactly with these guys, but these guys are very important because they both come to film and they come to an interesting dilemma between realism and expressionism, or what Arnheim called formalism. The basic thread here is that Arnheim believed that movies could challenge our understandings about reality and make them fanciful, mysterious, weird, aesthetic, and beautiful, abstract, intellectual. Krakauer believed the more real, the better. So people will learn, people will function better, people will see what life is really like and have that remind them back at movies, okay? They're apples and oranges. No one theory is necessarily better than the other. The point is both of these smart fellows gave legitimacy to the rise of film to be studied as an art form, like dance and theater and literature and so forth, okay? Arnheim's information is on page 460, I believe. Hold on just a sec. Where do you go? Sorry. Yes, 460. And Arnheim is formalist film theory or expressionist film theory, just like in chapter 1. Okay. And I can't emphasize enough the pictorial examples that Giannetti uses. Even if you haven't seen the film, look through those pictorial examples. They really help. They help give logic to some of the stuff that may run over your head. I mean, look, there's an example of Wizard of Oz. I mean, The Wizard of Oz is not a realistic movie, but it's a movie you've seen a million times. You take in the idea, of course, it's a fantasy. Arnheim would love a movie like that for a variety of reasons. Krakauer, probably not so much, right? Look at the ones that you understand, that you can understand, but look at the ones you haven't even seen, because that way you'll learn and you have a little bit more sense of what the textbook's trying to tell you. This textbook, as I mentioned the first day, is a little long-winded. He's a very smart guy, but he really does a good job of updating his examples as much as possible. And his examples are very resonant. They're very valuable. The pictorial examples work quite well, in my view. I think it's the best thing about his textbook. Okay? So, film theory, you start to get some college-level classes in the United States in the late 1940s having film studies classes. I think the University of Iowa was the first one to actually have a film studies class in late 40s. Now, across the Atlantic Ocean in France, after World War II, there's an influx of American films, and to some degree British films, but mainly American films that were not allowed to pervade the French marketplace during World War II. World War II was 1939 to 1945. So after 45 and France is liberated from the Nazis and the Allied powers win World War II and things start to go back to normal, there's this glut of American films that play all through France. And suddenly what starts to happen after World War II in late 40s and all through the 1950s is this intellectual community in France particularly, but elsewhere in the world, that become movie, how do I put this? There becomes this intellectual fervor for movies. And there becomes this sort of like dynamic, critical, interesting area of studying films and filmmakers. And primarily because American films could not penetrate the French market during World War II. So after World War II, they came flooding in, and you get these critics and these young people who are just crazy about films. And they start writing about films and filmmakers along the way. They give credence and value to movie makers as real artists. And this intellectual community is headed by this Frenchman called André Bazin, B-A-Z-I-N. And André Bazin is the editor-in-chief of a film journal that in French is Cahiers du Cinéma. In English, it means Cinema Notes. And this film journal and this entire increasingly larger intellectual film fan community becomes really somewhat influential in terms of writing about movie makers and film in general. Okay? So, first you have Arnheim and Krakauer and some other people talking about films in a much more scholastic way. And then 15 or 20 years later, you have the dynamics of World War II changing things. And for whatever reason, the French, who always loved cinema, and particularly American cinema, they kind of rediscover American movie makers that they couldn't get a chance to watch during World War II. And that leads to this intellectual community, kind of a cafe community, kind of like a Silicon Valley that we have now, right? Where 30 years ago, people were starting the internet, right? Dorks, really, but really smart dorks, right? it's the same with these intellectual French guys who were sitting around thinking about not only American movies, but Asian movies and British films that they didn't get a chance to see. And they're angry at their own then contemporary French film movement, which was stale and stuffy and making films about the 1600s or French counts or Marie Antoinette or guys with wigs on, you know what I mean? That kind of stuff, or old war films. And this film journal, Cahiers du Cinéma, or Cinema Notes, is run by this guy called André Bazin. And he has a lot of workers, writers, critics working for him who are really into it. They're really into it. It's almost like, I don't know, they may be the equivalent of in today's world where the people go to Comic-Con and write about it all the time, webmasters or people who have these websites or write about it all the time, right? So what happens is this journal becomes influential in terms of European and also American cinema. And what comes of André Bazin, who's this terrific guy, and some of his writers, is they developed this theory called the auteur theory, which is another French word. Auteur is A-U-T-E-U-R, and auteur just means author in French. And the auteur theory really more or less developed out of the work of a lot of these critics in Cahiers du Cinéma or Cinema Notes, and under the umbrella of André Bazin and some of his film theories. And what it tries to get at is the notion of that it's the director who's the most important person in the artistic output of movies. It's the director who's the most important person in the artistic output of movies. Now, you may think to yourself, okay, doesn't everybody know that? You may think, yeah, I kind of know some movie maker directors. I understand that, you know, they're the author of the films, even if they don't write the films, right? But you have to understand, this is in the 1950s and into the 60s. Really, up until that time, most moviegoers, even most critics, didn't know too much about the movie director. The movie director was just a guy, usually a guy, who was hired to get the film finished. If anything, it was the star who made a movie. Or sometimes it was the studio who was people recognized who made a movie successful, I should say. Occasionally you'd get a director that would pop through here and there in the public consciousness, but not really. It was the stars that people knew, sometimes the genre people were interested in, sometimes the studio, and sometimes even the writer. But the auteur theory says no, even if a person writes a movie, it's the director who's most responsible because this is a visual medium. No one goes to a movie to read anything. They go to a movie to see something and hear something. And it's the director and mostly his, just historically, his choices that have made movies that are any good worth understanding, and they're understanding it through that person. So the auteur theory said it's the director, not the studio, not the star, not the actor, not the writer. It's the director in consultation with all the other people, cameraman, you know, cinematographer, editor, but they all report to the director. The director is the person whose signature style and personality, cinematic personality, not necessarily their personal personality, but their cinematic personality is revealed through their work. So the director is the most important person, and the personality of the director comes out in their work. And it comes out because in order for an auteur director to be considered auteur, that particular director has repeated cinematic styles and cinematic themes that they return to over and over and over again, regardless of genre. Okay? That their own cinematic style comes through because of the repeated themes that they utilize and cinematic style over and over and over again, regardless of genre. Okay? And it was the French who started to recognize this with American filmmakers and some Asian filmmakers. And they started to say, if you watch Alfred Hitchcock films, he always does this, 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 and this. If you watch Howard Hawks films, he always does this, 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 and this. And you can see a particular kind of style. Now, in today's cinema, you could say somebody like, certainly Martin Scorsese, even though he's 74 years old, he's still an auteur movie maker. It doesn't matter what his movies are about. He's made many movies about the mafia, but he's also made a feminist movies. He made a movie about the, what's his name? The Dalai Lama. He's made he made a movie about priests. All his movies are about sin and redemption. And he's always moving his camera quickly, at least 90% of the time, right? Scorsese uses repeated themes and styles in his films, and he has, regardless of the genre, he has a signature style that's easily recognizable. Spielberg does the same thing. Spike Lee does the same thing. Quentin Tarantino does the same thing. I mean, how many times can you see a dead person in the trunk in a Quentin Tarantino movie, right? Over and over and over again. That's just a dopey note, but it happens all the time in his films. The auteur theory really comes out of a couple of different things. One is the work of Andre Bazin. Andre Bazin is a film theorist who's also interested in realism. To him, the cinema is best when it's depicting a sense of realism. But Bazin doesn't necessarily care that the film looks necessarily realistic. That's Krakauer. For Krakauer, the highest form of film is a documentary showing real life. Look at it, it's real. Think about it. Bazin is interested in realism, yes, and he thinks realism conveys the human condition a great deal. But for Bazin, it's not that it has to look real or evoke the real world. For him, it's about what he would call emotional realism, right? It's about what emotion feels true and right that people could sympathize with and people could understand and that people in the audience could identify with, right? Even if the technique is not necessarily espousing realism, it's the emotional core. Like, think about a close-up, right? Think about a character who's walking toward the camera and is 100 feet away. And let's just say it's a guy with his girlfriend. And let's just say the guy is walking toward the camera and you see him 100 feet away. And then he walks right up to the camera and he's right in front of the camera. And his girlfriend says, I want to break up with you. And then the man stops right in front of the camera. And now we're close in. I mean, that's not realism, right? I mean, that's artificial to come right in close to the camera, right? But what's key in that scene is that we're close with him and intimate with him and feeling his pain because his girlfriend's dumping him, right? Or if there's lots of different shadows, or if there's camera movement that swirls this way and that. Those aren't techniques for realism necessarily. But for Bazin, he's saying, I don't really care about the technique as long as the emotional core is real, as long as you feel something about that character, as long as there's a certain degree of pain, or tenderness, or joy, or fun, or silliness, or sexiness, or whatever it is. He says that movies can do that better than any other art form because they move, right? So Arnheim likes it weird and goofy. Krakauer likes it real as possible. But for Bazin, he's saying cinema is better than theater because theater, everybody's on the stage doing this, this, and this, and it's very exaggerated. If you read a book, you're reading a book and you're thinking and you can feel it and it's great, but it doesn't show you anything. If you listen to music, it's up to your imagination, it's beautiful, but it's in here, right? Now, it can get to your heart too, but for Bazin, he's saying that movies have the ability to show real life, but more importantly, show real emotions. and make you identify without any of the tricks that theater does, or the artificiality of theater, or the artificiality of reading, artificiality of music, or architecture, or whatever, because it's coming to you through the screen. So Bazin was a really great humanist. He was a person who thought that art should make people feel and think things. And he tended to favor realistic depictions of films because they usually do that. And today's filmmaker, Francois Truffaut, he is Bazin's star pupil, so to speak, who wrote for Cahiers du Cinéma, or Cinema Notes, and then made today's film and dedicated to Andre Bazin, who died early, who died young. Bazin was like a father figure to Truffaut. Truffaut was someone who was relatively poor and was in a loveless household. He was adopted, and today's film is essentially partly autobiographical, okay? And what today's film tries to do, or tonight, the film you're hopefully see in the next little while, it tries to espouse both very realistic depiction of life, but more importantly, an emotional core of sympathy for this 15-year-old boy that the film is about. Okay. Pages 465 through 471 are the realist film theory stuff. 465 through 471. I'm sorry, the auteur theory stuff. And it piggybacks on some of the stuff I already said before. Okay. And on page 466, there's a beautiful photo montage of the character, Antoine Deneau, who we're going to see in today's film. And that particular character has been used in many of Truffaut's films ever since. And there's a fun picture of it. There's an interesting picture of the photo montage of films Love on the Run, Stolen Kisses, Love at 20, Bed and Board, and The 400 Blows. Now, about today's film. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are actually getting to see these films. Again, my deep heart apology. There's nothing I can do about this than ask you to try to watch these films as you can in whatever way you can. I don't kid myself that the whole class is going to run right out to watch a 60-year-old film that's in French. I just will say that it's a very sweet, touching, somber film. And even if you just watch some of it, just try to watch some of it. But I want to give you a plot to give a sense of what it's about. The film takes place in 1959 in contemporary Paris, and it's about a teenage boy who lives with his adopted father and his real mother. It's revealed that the mother was pregnant out of wedlock, and this other guy married her just to give the boy a name, so to speak. And they're relatively poor, not terribly poor, but relatively poor. And the boy just seems like he's somewhat unloved. The mother is very pretty, but also kind of mean and dopey. And he spots her having an affair on the street with some other guy. And the boy is not particularly close with his stepfather. He's not a stupid child, but he's a little bit lazy. And he gets in trouble at school a lot. And he gets in trouble with his parents a lot. And he's ultimately has some bad luck and does some stupid things and is sent to a detention hall for stealing a typewriter. And he goes to this detention hall and he stays there for a while. And his mother comes to talk with him, and she more or less tells him that he's not really welcome to come home and he's going to have to work in some sort of labor detention center. And then there's this long sequence where he's playing soccer with some of the boys outside, and he escapes and he starts to run. And there's this really long sequence where he runs, and he's running away from the caretakers of this detention center, and he runs, and he runs some more, and he runs some more, and he runs some more, and they're just following him running, and like you can tell that the camera's in a truck, and they're just following the boy running. And he comes down to this part of, I'm not sure where it is in France, but it's near an ocean, so I'm not sure what ocean it is, and I suppose the Atlantic Ocean somewhere. And he sees the ocean, and he runs up to the ocean, and he lets the tide come in and touch his feet or shoes or whatever. And it had been earlier said in the film that he had never seen the sea, the ocean. And he sees it finally, and then he turns back and looks right at the camera, and then the movie ends. And it's this like unexpected, the ending is not happy whatsoever. It's an abrupt ending. You don't know what's going to happen. And the film is loosely based on Francois Truffaut's real life, where he was in a detention center and he was able to escape out of it. And as luck would have it, he became interested in movies and found his way as a movie maker. But the movie is both a coming-of-age story, but it's a movie that left audiences in the early 60s with a whole different feeling about what movies were supposed to be about. It was very fresh for its time period, very original, and it espoused heavily the idea of cinematic realism. It was Francois Truffaut's first film, and he was fresh off his very intellectual and stirring time at Cahiers du Cinéma, or Cinema Notes, and he was itching to make a film that reflected his own particular experiences. But even more than that, in terms of the influence this film had, he was interested in making a film that was so much different than the then stagey, corny, expensive, overdone, Hollywood-esque, superficial films made in France all through the 1950s. He was interested in challenging the normalcy of French films, which they had this certain tendency, as it was referred to in Cahiers du Cinéma, to just do films about France's past, about famous French writers from the past, about kind of dopey romantic comedies that no one cared about, overexpensive films that were silly and not important. And he made this film that's quiet, contemplative, sad, somber, in black and white, shot in real locations, real apartments, real schools, with like long takes. I mean, you may find that a little boring in 2020. I mean, there's a sequence in his I guess it's his high school, maybe middle school, something like that, and it seems as if it's the 1800s, right? I mean, it's a French countryside school or something, and just the length of time the camera is on is to evoke that sense of real time. So you have to be a little bit patient with that if you do watch the film and see I mean, it's not a long film, but the sequences meander for a little while because Truffaut was trying to show real life as much as possible, and just some of the weird things that happen in real life and how they happen realistically, and negative things that happen. And there's a beautiful famous shot where the boy's taken away to the detention center, and he's in what's called like a paddy wagon, I guess, behind this chain fence, and he kind of sadly puts his hand through it as if he can't escape, and it cuts it goes across his face, demonstrating the torment that the poor boy is under for some minor thing that he did that he's going to be punished over the top for. The film is really about this sense of realism. A couple other things about the film that you should think about. It's on location shooting. The entire thing is shot in the city of Paris, and real apartments, real buildings, real schools. Everything about it is real. It has very, very somber music. The music is to evoke this sense of kind of confusing age for the boy. There's lots of handheld camera and lots of moving camera in the film to really feel like the environment that was then so utterly contemporary and much different than the staginess of French films at the time. I mean, it's anti-staginess, anti-Hollywood, or Hollywood-esque. It's not Hollywood, but you know what I mean, Hollywood-esque. It has an unconventional ending, right? It's an open-ended ending. You have no idea what's going to happen to this kid, right? It leaves you feeling like somber and sad for the boy. You're not sure what's going to happen. Long takes, not just long takes, but long takes, again, to evoke the sense of realism. And the movie has a decent amount of dialogue, improvised dialogue that, I mean, it's scripted, generally speaking, but the boy is allowed to act and say whatever came to his mind. There's one sequence when he's at the detention center when he's being interviewed by a psychiatrist, and the kid is just looking right at the camera, just off to the camera like this. And you can tell he's just talking to someone like he's talking to someone, like if the psych was right here. And it's a female psychiatrist, and she asks him some probing personal questions. And the young actor, who's really great in the movie, I mean, he's just so good. I don't know how children can act, but they do. And he was not given any, he had to make up his own answers as the character. And he does splendidly. And you're so sympathetic for him. I mean, I know that this is not the kind of movie that you would probably want to seek out. But if you give it a half an hour and just stay with it, it's really a tender-hearted film. But the point is, 2020, Norwalk, Connecticut, yeah, maybe it's not going to make a big splash for you. 1959, 1960 France, and anybody who was interested in cinema, it was so refreshing. It was so realistic. It was so humanistic, right, that it helped propel what became known the world over as the French New Wave. And the French New Wave had a number of very influential filmmakers, Francois Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Eric Rohmer, Agnes Varda, and a bunch of ones I can't even think of right now, who became very, very famous. And they were related to the Italian New Wave 10 years earlier, and direct influence on the American New Wave of the 1960s, for those of you in my 60s course. Every movie maker in the 60s that we're talking about in the 60s course, virtually every one of them, will tell you that they were inspired by the French New Wave and the Italian New Wave a decade or so earlier than their time. So this film was very, very influential, even though I think if you see it with 2020 Norwalk, Connecticut eyes, you may be a bit bored by it and think, well, not a whole lot happens in this movie. 60 years ago, it was very refreshing to see that, rather than the stage corniness of French films about, I don't know, Victor Hugo or the French Revolution or something, okay? With fancy wigs and Marie Antoinette and that kind of stuff. It was rooted in realism. It was rooted in emotional realism and humanism. And it's a film that's really is, it's brave because of its subject matter. And it's also a coming of age film that's pretty sad, but tender-hearted, right? The kid is really quite good in it, okay? So, in terms of where we stand, this is column 154. As I mentioned to you before, a number of you have still not sent in your tests. If you're seeing this video, I'm not mad that you haven't sent in your tests. I just need to hear from you one way or another. If you had a blackout, if you're sick, or whatever it is, just email me, okay? Just email me and tell me who you are and what class you're in. You have to identify yourself. You have to say, Shields, this is Joe Blow, COM 154, or Jane Blow, or whatever, Jane Smith, COM 154. Here's my problem. Because I have 5 classes, over 100 students, and about 10 million emails. But I will get back to you, okay? So we have this. We only have 3 films left in this semester, because the semester started on a Thursday, so we're like a couple days ahead of the rest of your classes. So we have the 400 Blows, and the next week we have Forrest Gump, which most of you, I'm sure, have seen Forrest Gump, and you'll have to read the chapter on ideology. Forrest Gump is a film that I think is a good film in a lot of ways, but I also think it's a very good teaching tool about ideology, because it's a rather conservative film when you really break it down as a text. And then the last film of the year is a film called Citizen Kane, which is every introduction to film studies professor's duty to teach Citizen Kane, even though you may be bored by it. And there's an entire chapter of the textbook devoted to Citizen Kane. So we'll go over some of that stuff. Please let me know if you're not seeing the films for whatever reason, if you don't have Amazon or you haven't been able to find any clips. It's not your fault. I can't make you pay for the films. I can't make you do that. It's not your responsibility. But if you're not seeing any of the films, you have to at least really pay attention to what I'm saying in these lectures, because, I'm not sure how to say this. If you don't, then, maybe you're not getting any education out of it. So and it'll show up on your exams. So just do the best you can. Some of them, they're all on Amazon Prime. I know some of them cost about $4. Now, it's a lot for me to ask, but even if you can just get some clips somewhere, and sometimes on local libraries, you can stream things with library cards, but do your best you can, okay? The other thing is, as I mentioned, I think last week, it's real important that you guys have a sense of pre-registration. God knows what's going to be happening in the fall. It's my hope that we'll all return to the classroom in the fall. But, I've already gotten some emails from people who look like they're coming from other colleges to NCC because of the effect of the economy that COVID has had. Which is okay for us if people do come back to NCC from UConn or whatever, but because of it's much cheaper at NCC. But you really have to make sure that you're paying attention to what you think you might need for the fall. Now, I'm teaching 2 film studies classes in the fall. If that means anything to you. One is Focus on the Director, COM 256. I'm teaching that on Thursdays, which deals with auteur theory. And the other one is American Film, not American Film Heritage. That's a 200 level class that I'm teaching right now. But American Film is 157, COM Arts 157, and it's a class in independent cinema, pretty contemporary cinema, okay? That's on Tuesdays. Plus I'm teaching Mass Comm 101, which I always do. 2 sections of that. Also, for you people who are Mass Comm majors, understand this, that this summer, there's going to be a class in journalism, a 200 level journalism class that's being offered. If you need a 200 level writing class, take it. In the fall, there's going to be 2 200 level journalism classes. All of you need at least 1 200 level class in communication arts, 200 level writing class, that is. One is called Media Writing with a terrific professor who works for Bloomberg News, who lives over in New Canaan. She just told me she's going to do it. And that's on Monday and Wednesdays at 11:30. Media Writing, COM 215. And the other one is once a week, Tuesday nights, called Digital Journalism. So try to sign up for that if you can. Do not let yourself slip away into the summertime before you try to at least see what you need for the fall semester. I'm also teaching a summer film studies course, COM 256, the same one I'm teaching in the fall. I have to do it online. Apparently, all summer classes are still staying online. Normally, I would be telling you guys all this to the summer class, because I always give the students bagels or donuts on Thursdays, but I don't think I can do that this semester. So if you're interested in taking a summer class with me, it's up on the board. It's COM 256. It's about 4 weeks. It looks like we have to do it online. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that with the cinema class, but we'll do the best we can. And but the key is to at least see where you stand in relation to your degree and see what courses you need. I'd be happy to go over it with you, either by email or maybe Zoom or phone calls or whatever. A couple of students have done so far, but only a couple, okay? Normally we would be doing it right now in the classroom or in my office, so people would stop by. Please don't wait till I don't have any time to do it, okay? Think about what courses you may want in the fall. All the courses are up online. Although strangely, there was a snafu and there are no faculty names listed to any courses that I'm teaching, but I'm teaching those 2 courses I told you, and those other 2 people those people are teaching those courses. They're going to be up there as long as, in our film studies or our filmmaking courses too, are going to be up there, okay? So try your best to see the film, The 400 Blows. The title is a misnomer. The title is supposed to mean raising hell, but somehow or another they mentioned something got lost in the translation where they named it. It was almost like the literal translation was 400 ways to raise hell or something along those lines. But it's a very sweet, powerful film for its time period and really influenced the changing of the guard in French and European cinema, and was trying to go after a different feeling of humanism as a homage to André Bazin and Cahiers du Cinéma. Okay? I shall send an email telling you about this lecture. Have a good weekend. Please stay in touch, and please, please stay safe. You got to be diligent. Got to bend that curve, okay? Have a good evening.